The Winter Lantern Festival had always been the one night I forced myself to leave the farm. 3 years had passed since the fever took my wife, and the house still carried her absence in every quiet corner. My daughters were the only reason I kept rising before dawn. They were 6 now, born minutes apart, and they filled the silence with enough noise to keep the walls from closing in. Lena was the loud one. She spoke before she thought and ran before she looked. Lyra was quieter, but her eyes missed nothing. On nights like this, when the whole town hung lanterns from every post and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the square, I brought them out so they could remember what laughter sounded like. We had just passed the old oak near the stone well when I saw her. She sat alone on the low stone bench beneath the tree, shoulders hunched beneath a worn gray cloak. The light from the nearest lantern caught the edge of her face. Green skin, tusks, an orc woman crying quietly into her hands while the festival moved around her as if she were invisible. No one stopped. No one offered a word. I slowed, ready to steer the girls away. They had seen orcs before, mostly traders passing through, but I had taught them to keep their distance. The war had ended years ago, yet the fear had not. Before I could speak, Lena broke free. She ran straight to the bench, her small boots kicking up frost. Lyra followed a step behind, always her sister's shadow. "Don't cry, ma'am," Lena said, her voice bright and certain. "You can borrow our father." Lyra nodded, solemn. "And you can borrow us too. We're very good at making people smile." The orc woman lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but the surprise in them was sharper than the cold. She looked at the 2 small humans standing in front of her as if they had spoken in a language she had never heard before. I reached them in 3 long strides, heart hammering. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "They don't mean any disrespect. They're just children." The woman wiped her face with the back of her hand. When she answered, her voice was low and rough with disuse. "They are kind," she said. "That is not something to apologize for." Up close I could see she was perhaps 30, though hardship had carved lines around her eyes. Her cloak was patched and thin. A small cloth bag rested on her lap. She did not look like a threat. She looked like someone who had been walking for a very long time with nowhere left to arrive. Lena was not finished. "Are you crying because someone hurt your heart?" she asked. I opened my mouth to stop her, but the orc woman answered before I could. "I miss my family," she said simply. Lyra reached out and took the woman's large hand in both of hers. The contrast was almost absurd, small pink fingers against green skin. "Then come have hot cocoa with us," Lyra said. "It helps when you feel cold inside." The woman hesitated. Her gaze moved from the girls to me. I saw the calculation there, the habit of expecting doors to close. "If you're not in a hurry," I heard myself say. "We were just heading to the warm hearth. The girls have been asking for it all evening." She studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slow and careful. The tavern was crowded and loud, exactly the kind of place where an orc woman usually drew stares. Yet with 2 small girls on either side of her, most people only glanced once before returning to their own conversations. We found a corner table. Lena and Lyra climbed onto the bench so they could sit pressed against her. They talked without pause. About the rooster that ruled the hen house like a tyrant. About how I burned porridge almost every morning, about their mother, who had loved stories and whose voice they were beginning to forget. The woman listened to all of it. When they mentioned their mother, her eyes grew wet again, but she did not look away. "My name is Myra Voss," she said when there was finally a pause. "I was a seamstress once, before the fires." She did not explain which fires. I did not ask. Some losses are too large for a festival night. The cocoa arrived, thick and sweet, topped with a curl of cream. Mara held the cup between both hands, as if warming herself from the inside out. She drank slowly. When Lena offered her the last piece of honey bread, she accepted it with a quiet thank you that seemed to cost her something. We stayed longer than I had planned. The girls eventually grew sleepy, leaning against Myra's sides as if they had known her for years instead of an hour. She did not move them. She simply sat still, letting them rest. When it was time to leave, the square had thinned. Most lanterns were still burning, but the crowd had gone home to warm beds. We walked together as far as the oak tree. The girls hugged her without being asked. Lena wrapped her arms around Myra's waist. Lyra stood on tiptoe and whispered something I could not hear. Myra looked down at them, then at me. For the first time that night, she smiled. It was small and tired, but it reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for the cocoa, and for not turning away." I wanted to say something that would keep her from walking back into whatever darkness she had come from. Instead, I only nodded. Lyra tugged on my sleeve as we turned toward the road home. "Papa," she asked softly, "will she be lonely tomorrow too?" I did not have an answer. Behind us, Myra stood beneath the oak, the lantern light painting her cloak in shifting gold. She watched us go. I felt the weight of that gaze between my shoulders long after we had left the square. That night, after the girls were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cooling tea and thought about the way she had held the cocoa like it was something precious. I thought about how quiet the house felt without her in it. I told myself she was just a stranger passing through. I almost believed it. 2 days later, I went into Briarfall for flour and salt. The market was busy with the usual morning crowd, and I kept my head down, moving quickly between the stalls. I had no intention of lingering. The farm always needed something, and the girls would be waiting. I was paying the miller when I noticed her. She sat on a low stool outside the cloth merchant's shop, a basket of mending balanced on her knees. The gray cloak was the same one she had worn at the festival, though she had pulled the hood back. Sunlight fell across her face as she worked, needle moving with steady precision through a torn sleeve. The shopkeeper, a thin man with a permanent scowl, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. "You're taking up space again," he said loudly enough for passers-by to hear. "People see an orc sitting here, and they walk past my door. I should charge you rent for the stool." Mara did not look up. She simply kept stitching, her large hands careful with the small fabric. I paid for the flour and walked over before I had decided what I was going to say. "Do you mend children's clothes?" I asked. She lifted her head. For a moment, she seemed not to recognize me. Then something in her expression shifted, a flicker of the same surprise she had shown when Lena first spoke to her. "I do," she said quietly. I glanced at the shopkeeper, who was now watching us with open curiosity. "My daughters have torn a few things," I said. "Shirts, a dress. Nothing fancy. Would you be willing to come to the farm and do the work there? During the day. You could eat lunch and leave whenever you're finished. No one will ask you to stay longer than you want." She studied me for a long moment, the needle still between her fingers. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the habit of expecting the offer to be withdrawn the moment she accepted it. "I can pay fairly," I added, "and the girls would be glad to see you." At the mention of the girls, something in her shoulders eased. "Very well," she said. "I can come tomorrow, if that suits you." "It does." She gave a small nod and returned to her stitching. I walked away feeling oddly lighter than I had when I arrived. The next morning she came on foot, arriving just after the sun had burned the frost from the fields. The twins spotted her from the kitchen window and were out the door before I could call them back. Lena reached her first, grabbing her hand as if they were old friends. Lyra followed more quietly but stood close, looking up at her with open curiosity. They took her on a tour of the farm before she had even set down her basket. They showed her the chicken coop and explained in great detail why the rooster was a tyrant. They introduced her to the new calf, still wobbly on its legs. They brought her inside and pointed out the small room that had once been their mother's, though they did not go in. Mara listened to all of it without interrupting, her expression gentle. I left them to it and went out to check the fences. When I returned at midday, the kitchen table was covered with neatly folded clothes. Mara had already mended 3 shirts and was working on a small blue dress that had belonged to Elena. She worked quickly and without waste, her stitches small and even. While the stew I had left on the stove heated, she noticed the torn curtain above the sink. Without asking, she took a needle and thread from her basket and began to repair it. Later, when Lyra brought her the one-eared teddy bear she slept with, Myra sat on the floor and sewed the missing ear back on with the same careful attention she had given the curtain. Lena watched her work. "I don't remember everything about Mama anymore," she said suddenly. "Sometimes I try really hard, and I still can't hear her voice." Myra tied off the thread and handed the bear back to Lyra. "Not remembering everything does not mean you do not love her," she said. "Love stays even when the small things fade." Lena was quiet for a moment, then nodded as if that made perfect sense. We ate lunch on the porch because the kitchen felt too small with all of us inside. The girls sat on either side of Mara again, the way they had at the tavern. I sat across from them and watched the way she listened, really listened, when they spoke. After the girls wandered off to play near the barn, I stayed at the table. The afternoon sun was warm on the wood. For a while, neither of us said anything. My wife's name was Elena, I said finally. She died when the girls were 3. Fever took her in 3 days. Mara looked out across the yard, her hands resting on the table. I am sorry, she said. I keep thinking I should be better at this, I continued. Being both father and mother. Some days I manage. Most days I feel like I am only pretending. She was quiet for a long time. No one is enough by themselves, she said at last. But children remember the ones who stay. That is what matters to them. The words were simple. There was no pity in them, only truth. They settled somewhere deep in my chest, in a place I had not let anyone touch since Elena died. She left before the sun began to set, as she had promised. The girls hugged her at the gate. I watched her walk down the road until she disappeared around the bend. That night the house felt larger than it had in months. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the mended curtain, the folded clothes, the teddy bear sitting on the bench with both ears intact. Everything was exactly as it had been before she came. Only better. I told myself she was only coming to work, that it was practical, that the girls needed clothes mended and I had no skill with a needle. I almost believed it. But when I went to bed, I found myself wondering what she would mend next and whether she would stay long enough to drink a second cup of tea before she left. The rumors reached me on a market day. I had gone into Briarfall for nails and a new blade for the plow. I was at the blacksmith stall when I heard 2 women talking behind me, their voices low but not low enough. That orc woman has been going to Darian Holt's farm, one said. 3 times in the last week, they say. Poor man, the other replied. He's been alone too long. Grief makes a man do foolish things. And those girls of his, they don't know any better. I paid for the nails without turning around. My hands were steady, but something hot and ugly had begun to burn behind my ribs. By the time I reached the grain merchant, I had heard 3 more versions of the same story. One man claimed Myra was only pretending to mend clothes so she could steal from the house. Another said she was trying to worm her way into my bed now that I was a widower with land. The worst one came from the baker's wife, who said the girls should not be left alone with that creature. I left town earlier than I had planned. When I reached the farm, Mara was already there. She was sitting on the porch steps with Lyra, helping her untangle a ball of yarn. Lena was running circles around the yard with a stick, pretending it was a sword. The moment Mara saw my face, she knew. She stood up slowly. You heard them, she said. I nodded. Myra looked down at her hands. I should not come here anymore. Lena stopped running. Why? Myra did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Because people are talking. Because I am orc, and you are human, and because some wounds never close. Lyra's small face crumpled. Did we do something wrong? No, Mara said quickly. She knelt so she was level with both girls. You have done nothing wrong. You have been kind. Kinder than most. Lena's eyes filled with tears. Then why are you leaving? Myra looked at me. I saw the exhaustion in her, the old habit of being unwanted. I stepped forward. You are not a problem, I said. Not in this house. She shook her head. I am orc. For many people, that is already enough to be a problem. Not here, I answered. Not with us. Lena wiped her face with her sleeve and said fiercely, Our house has enough chairs for you. Lyra nodded. And enough blankets. Myra's eyes grew bright. She reached out and touched Lena's cheek, then Lyra's. She did not speak, but I saw the way her shoulders trembled. 3 days later, the rumors were still moving through the village like smoke, but something happened that changed their shape. Lena had taken to following the new calf around the lower pasture. That afternoon, she chased it too far, all the way to the stream that ran behind the eastern fence. The water was still partly frozen from the long winter. She must have stepped onto the ice to reach the calf. The ice cracked. I was on the far side of the field mending a fence post. By the time I heard the splash and started running, Mara was already moving. She had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house. She dropped the basket and ran faster than I thought possible for someone her size. She reached the stream just as Lena's head disappeared under the dark water. Mara did not hesitate. She plunged straight in. The cold must have been brutal. She waded in up to her chest, found Lena, and pulled her out in one motion. By the time I reached them, Myra was on the bank, holding my daughter against her chest. Lena was coughing and crying, soaked through. Myra's clothes were heavy with water, and her lips had already turned a faint blue. She would not let go of Lena until I took her. I have her, I said. You need to get warm. Myra's teeth were chattering too hard to answer. 2 men from the neighboring farm had seen the whole thing. One of them, old Tom, came down to the bank with a blanket. He handed it to Myra without a word. The other man simply stood there, staring, before turning and walking back toward the road. Word spread differently after that. Some of the talk softened, not all of it. But enough that when I went to the market the next day, the baker's wife only gave me a stiff nod instead of whispering behind her hand. That night, Myra developed a fever. She tried to leave after dinner, but her hands were shaking and she could barely stand. I made her stay in the small guest room at the back of the house. I built up the fire and brought her extra blankets. The girls kept trying to come in until I finally told them Myra needed rest. Late in the evening, when the house had gone quiet, I sat beside her bed and changed the cloth on her forehead. Her skin was burning. She opened her eyes once and looked at me. "Lena," she whispered, "is she all right?" "She's fine," I said, "because of you." Myra closed her eyes again. A small, tired smile touched her mouth. I sat there for a long time after that, watching the firelight move across her face. I thought about the way she had run into the freezing water without hesitation. I thought about how she had held my daughter as if she were something precious. I thought about the empty space that had lived in my chest for 3 years and how, without quite realizing it, that space had begun to fill with something warmer every time she was near. I was no longer grateful. I was in love with her. I did not know what to do with the knowledge. It sat inside me like a living thing. Near midnight, I heard the soft creak of floorboards. Lena and Lyra appeared in the doorway, both in their nightclothes, barefoot. They crept in without asking and stood at the foot of the bed looking at Myra. Lena spoke first, her voice very small. "Papa," she whispered, "can Myra stay with us forever?" Lyra looked at me with those steady eyes that always saw more than they should. I did not answer them right away. I looked at Myra sleeping, at the 2 small girls standing in the dark, and at the quiet room that suddenly felt too small to hold everything that had changed. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees. Inside, the fire crackled softly. I still did not have the words, but for the first time since Elena died, I knew I wanted to find them. The morning Quran came, the sky was clear and cold, the kind of bright winter light that made everything look sharper than it should. I was splitting wood behind the barn when I heard the horses, not the steady clop of traders or the lighter step of village mounts. These were heavier, slower, the sound of animals that had traveled far through rough country. I set the axe down and walked around the side of the house. 4 orcs stood in the yard. The one in front was tall, even for his kind, broad through the shoulders, with a thick braid of black hair shot through with gray. His tusks were filed to points. He wore a heavy fur mantle over leather armor that had seen real use. Behind him stood 3 younger orcs, all armed, all watching the house with the careful stillness of people who expected trouble. Myra was already outside. She must have heard them coming. She stood on the porch steps, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale beneath the green of her skin. The tall orc spoke first. "Myra Voss," he said. His voice was deep and carried easily across the yard. "It is time you came home." She did not move. "I have no home there anymore, Corin," she answered. "You know that." Corin Blacktusk. Her distant cousin, she would tell me later. The one who had always believed strength was measured in what you could take and keep. "You are still blood," he said, "and blood has value. There is a warrior in the northern clans, a widower with good herds. He will take you. In return, we receive horses and winter grain. It is a fair trade." Myra's shoulders tightened. "I am not a thing to be traded for horses." Karan's eyes flicked past her to the house, then to me where I stood at the corner of the barn. He studied me the way a man studies something he intends to step over. "You have been living among humans," he said to her. "It has made you forget what you are." I walked forward until I was level with Myra. "She has not forgotten," I said. "She simply chose something else." Karan looked at me properly then. A slow, unpleasant smile touched his mouth. "You are the human who lets her stay," he said, "the one with the 2 small daughters. I have heard of you." He took 1 step closer. The 3 behind him shifted their weight. "An orc woman does not belong in a human house," Corin continued. "She belongs with her people, or she belongs to whoever will take her. You would be wise to step aside. I felt Mayra tense beside me. Before she could speak, I answered, She belongs where she chooses. Corin laughed once, short and ugly. Would you marry her, human? Would you stand before your village and call an orc without clan your wife, or do you only want her labor and her warmth at night? The words landed like a slap. I saw Mayra flinch. I looked at her. She was staring at the ground, her jaw tight, as if she already expected me to hesitate. As if she had spent her whole life being the thing people eventually decided was too much trouble. I turned back to Corin. If she will have me, I said clearly, I will marry her. Today, if that is what it takes for you to understand, she is not yours to bargain with. The yard went very still. Coran's smile faded. Behind him, one of the younger orcs muttered something I did not catch. Mayra lifted her head. She was looking at me now, her eyes wide and wet. Corin recovered first. You would truly bind yourself to a wanderer with no tribe, he asked. A woman who brings nothing but trouble. She brings more than you ever will, I said. He took another step. I did not move. Then Mayra spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. I am not goods to be traded for horses and grain, she said. I am not a debt your clan can settle with my body. You left me to starve after the fires took everything. You do not get to claim me now because I have become useful again. Corin's face darkened. You forget your place. No, Mayra said. For the first time, I remember it. She stepped forward until she stood between me and her cousin. I choose to stay here, she said, with these people, with this family. If you try to take me by force, you will have to kill me first, and even then, I will not go with you. Corin stared at her for a long moment. Then his gaze moved past her to the road. I followed his look. 3 men from the village were walking up the lane, tools still in their hands from the morning's work. Old Tom carried a scythe across his shoulders. 2 younger farmers walked beside him, both holding hoes like weapons. They stopped at the edge of the yard and said nothing. They simply stood there, watching. More figures appeared at the bend in the road. A woman with a basket, the blacksmith's apprentice. They did not come close, but they did not turn away either. Coran saw the gathering. He saw the way the numbers were shifting, slow but certain. He spat on the ground. You have chosen weakness, he said to Mayra. When the humans turn on you, do not come crawling back. I will not crawl anywhere, she answered. Not anymore. Corin turned without another word. His riders followed. They mounted and rode out the way they had come, the sound of hooves fading down the frozen road. Only when they were gone did Myra's legs seem to give. She sat down hard on the porch steps, her hands covering her face. The villagers lingered a moment longer, then began to drift away. Old Tom gave me a single nod before he left. It was not much, but it was something. I sat beside Mayra on the steps. For a while neither of us spoke. Finally she lowered her hands. You said you would marry me, she whispered. Did you mean it? Or was it only to make him leave? I looked at my hands. They were still shaking from the confrontation. I meant it, I said. I have meant it for longer than I let myself admit. She turned to me. Her eyes searched mine. I love you, I said. The words came out rough, but they were true. Not because you saved Lena. Not because the girls have grown attached to you. I love you because before you came, I was only moving through the days. I woke, I worked, I slept, I did what was needed. Then you sat at my table and listened to 2 small girls talk about a mother they are forgetting. And something in me remembered how to want more than survival. Mayra's breath caught. I am afraid, she said. I have nothing to bring to you. No clan, no land, only scars, and a name that means nothing here. You bring yourself, I answered. That is already more than I thought I would ever have again. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were cold. I love you too, she said quietly. I have loved you for weeks. I tried not to. I told myself it was only gratitude, only loneliness, but it is not. It is real. And it terrifies me more than Corin ever could. Before I could answer, the front door burst open. Lena and Lyra came running out, still in their indoor clothes, barefoot on the cold wood. They threw themselves at both of us, small arms wrapping around whatever they could reach. Lena pressed her face into Mayra's side. You don't have to borrow Papa anymore, she said, voice muffled. You can just keep him. Lyra looked up at me with solemn eyes. "And you can keep us too," she added. "If you want." Myra made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She gathered both girls against her and held them tightly. I put my arms around all three of them, feeling the solid weight of the life that had somehow grown around the empty spaces I had carried for 3 years. Karan was gone. The village was watching. The future was uncertain and probably difficult. But in that moment, on the steps of a small farmhouse under a winter sky, I knew with complete certainty that I would fight for this. For her. For them. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The wedding took place on the first warm day of spring when the last patches of snow had finally melted and the fields behind the house were beginning to show green. We held it in the yard, beneath the old oak that had started everything. There were no grand decorations, only a few garlands of early wildflowers the girls had gathered that morning. The old priest from Briarfall came, along with Tom and his wife, and 2 other families who had quietly begun to accept Myra after she pulled Lena from the frozen stream. Myra wore a simple dress the color of moss. She had altered it herself from a piece of fabric she had been saving. It was not new, but it was hers, and she had made it fit. Lena and Lyra walked ahead of her, scattering petals along the short path between the house and the oak. They kept glancing back to make sure she was still there, as if they feared she might disappear if they looked away too long. Before the ceremony began, Myra asked to speak with the girls alone. I watched from a short distance as she knelt in the grass, so she could look them in the eyes. Her voice was steady, but I could see how much the moment mattered to her. "I am not here to take your mother's place," she said. "She will always be your mother. Nothing can change that. If you will allow me, I only wish to love you in the way that is mine to give." Lena stepped forward first and wrapped her arms around Myra's neck. "Then we have 2 mothers in our hearts," she said. "One in the sky, and one here with us." Lyra nodded, quieter but certain. "That is enough," she added. Myra closed her eyes for a moment, as if steadying herself. When she opened them again, there were tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. The ceremony itself was short. The priest spoke the old words, and we made our promises in front of the few people who had chosen to stand with us. When it was done, Myra looked at me as though she still could not quite believe any of it was real. I took her hand and held it until the girls came running to pull us both into an embrace that nearly knocked us off balance. In the weeks that followed, Myra turned the small room beside the kitchen into a sewing space. She set up a table by the window and began taking in mending from the village. At first, only a few people came. Then, slowly, more arrived. Some still hesitated at the door when they saw her, but they came anyway. They brought torn shirts, worn trousers, and children's clothes that needed letting out or taking in. Myra never spoke of the past. She simply measured, stitched, and returned the garments better than they had arrived. Word spread that her work was honest and her prices fair. The whispers that had once followed her began to fade, replaced by the simple fact that she was useful and kind and present. I changed as well, though I did not notice it at first. For 3 years I had carried every burden alone because I believed I had no choice. Myra never told me to rest. She simply placed a plate of food in front of me on the evenings when I came in too tired to speak and sat beside me without demanding conversation. Her quiet presence slowly taught me that strength did not always mean carrying everything by myself. Sometimes it meant allowing someone else to share the weight. The girls grew in that same quiet way. Lena still talked constantly, but now she had someone who answered every question with patience instead of distraction. Lyra remained watchful, but the worry that had lived behind her eyes began to ease. They started calling her Mama Myra without anyone asking them to. It happened naturally, the way good things sometimes do when no one is forcing them. Every festival night, when the lanterns went up again in the square, one of them would inevitably bring up the beginning. "Do you remember," Lena would say, grinning, "the night we told you that you could borrow Papa?" Myra would laugh, the sound low and warm. "I remember," she would answer, "and in the end, I decided to keep him." I would sit nearby and listen to them, feeling the old ache in my chest finally begin to loosen its hold. I had believed for a long time that family was something I had lost and could never replace. I had been wrong. Family, I was learning, could also be something found by 2 small children who had simply refused to walk past a stranger crying beneath an oak tree. On quiet evenings now, I often stand at the edge of the porch and watch the three of them together. Mara sits with her sewing in her lap while the girls play or help or simply lean against her. The house no longer feels like a place I am only trying to survive inside. It feels like somewhere we are all choosing to stay. I think about that first winter night often, about the way Lena had run forward without fear, and how Lyra had followed, about the simple, impossible offer they had made to a woman they did not know. They had told her she could borrow me. Neither of us had understood back then that what they were truly offering was a beginning.